They didn't see him coming. That was their first mistake. The courtroom wasn't ready. Not for him. Not for the truth he carried like weight in his chest. The morning sunlight fell flat across the marble floor, sterile and unforgiving as the routine hum of legal chatter carried on inside. Papers rustled. A cough echoed. The ordinary rhythm of justice, practiced and indifferent, until the doors at the rear creaked open. He didn't walk in. He rolled in. An old wheelchair, scratched at the arms, one wheel creaking every few turns. His clothes looked worn, not by design, but by life. Olive green coat frayed at the cuffs. A cap faded from too many seasons under the same sun. A man who looked like he belonged to no one and nowhere, invisible or worse, unwelcome. Raymond Ellis didn't look up. His pace was slow, deliberate, not because of age or the wheelchair, but because every movement, every breath was chosen. He'd come here for a reason, a truth buried too long, a name the system had forgotten but he had never stopped carrying. He rolled down the center aisle, his gaze soft but unwavering. The front row, left side, 3 feet from the witness stand. That was his place. That was where he parked his chair. Quietly. No fanfare, just presence still. And then, like a blade through glass, her voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir," she said, clipped and precise, like a warning wrapped in protocol. "This isn't a shelter. You might be lost." Officer Valerie Grayson. Blue uniform crisp, blonde hair tied back with military sharpness. The kind of authority that never asked. It announced. She stood above him, her hand resting casually near the holster on her hip. Not drawn, but not far. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was the kind of tone meant to perform, meant to remind the room who belonged and who didn't. He didn't respond. He didn't argue. He simply reached into his coat, pulled out a weathered wallet and unfolded it with the kind of care reserved for sacred things. Behind the cracked plastic of the ID window, there wasn't a badge. Not yet. Just a small photograph. Faded. Folded at the corner. A boy. Maybe 14. Skin deep brown. Eyes wide, bright, but older than they should have been. A hint of pride in the way he stood, even as the photo aged around him. Raymond's fingers brushed the image like it was glass. He held it for a beat too, long. Then wordlessly he tucked it away, not because it was no longer needed, but because he never traveled without it close to his heart. Valerie stood there watching, expecting protest, rebellion. But Raymond didn't flinch, didn't even lift his head. Her brow tightened. She scoffed, not loud but just enough to be heard, and muttered under her breath, "Figures." Then turned on her heel. The courtroom didn't react, not a single voice, no objection, just polite complicity. A bailiff raised an eyebrow and looked away. But Raymond didn't. His gaze drifted to the judge's bench, to the figure presiding above it all. Judge Sylvia Whitaker, unmoved, uninterrupted. A face once familiar. He bowed his head, ever so slightly, as if the air still echoed with a name he hadn't spoken in years. This room, this marble box of silence and routine, wasn't new to him. He knew every creak of the wood, every lie the walls had swallowed whole, especially the one they buried 15 years ago, the one that belonged to Malik. But no one knew that yet. Raymond had returned not for vengeance, not for show, but for movement. And the wheels beneath him weren't the only thing turning. This wasn't just another man in a chair. This was the man who had come to make the system look itself in the eye. Officer Grayson returned, her voice sharper now, loud enough to be heard. "You're sitting in the wrong place, sir. That row is for witnesses." Raymond slowly looked up, his eyes steady, not defiant, just unshaken. His voice was quiet, level. "I have the right to sit here." Grayson folded her arms. "This isn't a waiting room. You're interrupting. Court business. Either move now or I'll move you myself." Still, Raymond didn't raise his voice, didn't posture. His fingers rested gently on the photo inside his coat pocket, the boy watching from another world. Because he knew, in rooms like this, volume gets mistaken for defiance, and defiance gets punished. She didn't wait. With a single motion, she grabbed the back of his wheelchair and yanked it sideways. The wheels screeched, his body lurched, his head jerked forward. A hollow gasp rippled across the room, not loud but sharp, like the air had been slapped. Still, no one moved, no one spoke, except her, a small voice from the back row. "Why are they doing that to him, Mommy?" A child's voice, young, pure, honest. The mother stiffened, embarrassed. She hushed the girl with a quick whisper. "Shh, don't look." But the room had already changed. Whitaker looked up briefly from her bench, eyes glancing over the scene without pause. No comment, no objection, just a flicker. Then she returned to her folder like it was just another Tuesday. The prosecutor, Rachel Knox, sitting quietly at the front, raised a brow but kept flipping through her documents, as though nothing remarkable had taken place. Valerie kept pushing, sharply, more forcefully than needed. Down the aisle, each push louder than the last. Not because of sound, but because of meaning. Raymond's hand remained on the photograph, not out of fear, not even resistance, but because letting go would have meant abandoning purpose. He turned his head just as they neared the courtroom doors. His eyes locked onto Judge Whitaker's, and in that second, she remembered. Her hand paused. Her breath caught. She knew who he was, and he knew that she knew. 15 years hadn't erased that decision, the one she signed without reading, the one she knew was wrong, but convenient. And the man from that quiet injustice had just rolled back into her courtroom, not as a lawyer, not as a witness, but as a man. Alone, until he wasn't. Valerie shoved open the doors with her hip, dragged him past the threshold like a misplaced file. The courtroom returned to its buzz, to its silence. But inside Raymond, something cracked open. Not rage, not revenge, resolve. As the doors shut behind him with a soft but final click, the world behind him returned to normal. That was their second mistake, because he had come back not just to sit. He had come to speak, and not with volume but with truth. One breath at a time, and they didn't see him now, but they would. The truth was never lost, it was buried, and Raymond Ellis came back to dig it up. The hallway was colder than it needed to be, not just in temperature but in presence, like the walls had heard what happened in the courtroom and were holding their breath. Raymond sat still for a moment just beyond the doors, adjusting the collar of his worn coat. His hands moved slowly, not because of weakness, but because this moment was about reclaiming something. A sliver of dignity from a floor that had tried to take it from him. Footsteps echoed from the far end, steady, deliberate, limping slightly. A man in a dark blue uniform approached, older, silver-haired, eyes sharper than they had any right to be at his age. He stopped when he saw the man in the wheelchair. His jaw clenched. A flicker passed across his face. Surprise, recognition, maybe even guilt. "Raymond Ellis?" the guard asked, voice low. "You're DOJ, aren't you?" Raymond didn't smile. He didn't nod with pride. He just reached into the inner lining of his coat and pulled out a leather badge case, cracked at the corners, faded from years of disuse. He opened it slowly, like revealing a wound. The badge wasn't polished. It didn't shine. But it was real. Still official. Raymond murmured. The old guard blinked, let out a breath like he'd been holding it since 2009. "It's been a long time. I didn't think they'd ever send anyone back for that." "They didn't," Raymond said simply. A silence passed between them. Thick, unspoken. The guard's eyes narrowed. "This is about that boy, isn't it?" "Malik Johnson." Raymond didn't answer immediately. His fingers traced the edges of the badge, then closed the case and tucked it away. He looked down, then back up. I buried it, he said quietly. Filed it. Told myself the system had spoken, but it hadn't. It just silenced him. The guard glanced up toward the security cameras lining the ceiling. Then without a word he gestured. Come with me. Raymond followed, the wheels of his chair humming softly over tile. They moved through a side door marked security personnel only, down a narrow stairwell dimly lit with flickering fluorescent lights. The air grew colder as they descended, like they weren't just going underground, but into something forgotten. Past the storage corridor filled with unused chairs and metal detectors, they reached a thick gray door. The guard punched in a code. The lock clicked open. Inside, the surveillance room. 4 walls covered in monitors, some in black and white, some in grainy color. Every hallway, every courtroom, every corner of the building played in looping silence. The buzz of old machines hummed like whispers of every wrong never spoken aloud. The guard shut the blinds, locked the door, then turned to Raymond. I'm not asking questions, he said. But whatever you're here for, be careful. Things haven't changed much since Malik. Just gotten better at hiding it. Raymond nodded slowly. The silence wrapped around him, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt earned, claimed. I'm not here to expose a person, he said. I'm here to expose a pattern. He rolled toward the monitor showing the very courtroom he'd just been dragged out of. Valerie Grayson had returned to her spot against the wall, arms crossed. That same smug awareness sat on her face. Rachel Knox was still sorting papers. Judge Whitaker hadn't moved. Raymond narrowed his eyes at the screen. They think they pushed me out, he muttered. They don't realize they just pushed me in. The guard sat beside him in a weathered leather swivel chair, leaned forward. What's the play? Raymond didn't look away. I watch, I wait. And when the moment comes, he reached into the side pocket of his wheelchair and pulled out a small black device, barely larger than a USB stick. I don't knock. He plugged it into a terminal beside the monitor. The screen flickered once, then again. The footage rewound itself, back to earlier that morning. Valerie's hand firm on the wheelchair, her sudden push, the screech of wheels across marble, the child's voice from the back. Why are they doing that to him, Mommy? Raymond clicked pause. Start. Here, he whispered. Let them hang themselves with their own footage. The guard crossed his arms, studied him quietly. You always were the quiet one, he said. But I remember, when you moved, it was never just one step. Raymond didn't respond. He didn't have to. He opened the latches on the case beside him with slow, deliberate movements. Each metallic click echoed off the concrete walls like a quiet reckoning. From within, he pulled out a thick yellow folder, soft at the corners from years of handling. Across the top, handwritten in faded black marker, Malik Johnson, 14 years, old. He opened it. The first page, arrest report. Next, witness statements. Then, photos, none submitted, none ever seen. He started reading aloud, not for the guard, but for himself, for Malik, for the record that never got its day. In 2009, Malik was arrested after a scuffle at a neighborhood basketball court. No one asked why he had bruises on his ribs. No one questioned how a boy that thin could assault an armed officer. No forensics, no guardian, no medical exam. The interview was done without legal counsel present. The petition for review was dismissed without comment. A photograph slipped loose, landed softly in Raymond's lap, black and white. Malik, seated in juvenile detention, his face swollen, lips split, one eye nearly shut. But it wasn't the injuries that struck the hardest. It was the look in his eyes. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking past it, past the bars, past the room, into the very soul of a system that had already given up on him. Raymond picked up the photo, held it close to his chest. Exhaled slowly. I read this file before, he whispered, and I knew the truth. I knew it. The guard said nothing. Raymond's voice dropped lower. But I stayed silent, because I was afraid. afraid of losing my job, of challenging the wrong people, but that boy, he was worth more than my entire career. He reached again into his coat, pulled out a scratched-up flip phone, hinges loose, plastic cracked, the kind of device nobody used anymore, except for the kind of people who never wanted to forget. He flipped it open, dialed. The number wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. It was etched into his bones. The call connected. A woman answered. Justice Department. Name and badge number. He didn't hesitate. This is Raymond Ellis, Inspector. Badge 17463. I'm invoking special oversight order under Section 42, Clause 121. A pause. Grounds? Evidence suppression. Racial bias. Procedural misconduct in the 2009 conviction of a juvenile still under active jurisdiction. Another beat of silence. Then the voice responded. Received. You are now granted full investigative access and independent authority. Please confirm the name of the case. Raymond looked at the folder. Malik Johnson. He closed the phone and placed it gently beside the file. Then he turned back to the screen. There was no anger in his eyes. Just the sharp, steady look of a man who had let silence bury the truth for too long, and now intended to unearth it piece by piece. He whispered again. Not to the guard. Not to the room. To the camera. To the courtroom. To all of them. Start here. When the quiet man came back through those doors, he wasn't the one on trial anymore. The courtroom was. It started with a sound. Not loud, just the soft click of the side door creaking open. But something about it shifted the air. It wasn't what people heard. It was what they felt. The temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. The light changed, like the room itself knew what was about to walk in. Raymond Ellis rolled through the threshold. He was no longer wearing the tattered olive jacket or the faded cap that made him invisible. Now he wore a crisp navy blue suit, pressed, sharp, unmistakably official. Pinned to his chest, glinting under the fluorescent courtroom lights, was a badge. Not metaphorical, not symbolic. A real Department of Justice identification. DOJ in black and silver. The same man they had dragged out of this room just hours earlier was now returning under full authority, and suddenly, everyone remembered they hadn't asked who he was. Valerie Grayson froze, mid-step. Her pen slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. For the first time all day, her voice didn't lead. Her silence did. Judge Whitaker blinked just once, but it was enough to betray recognition. Her hand shifted toward the microphone, then paused. Rachel. Knox looked up from her paperwork. Her fingers stilled. Raymond didn't look at any of them. He moved straight to the bench clerk, unhurried, eyes forward, posture calm, controlled. The room had gone quiet. Not by command, but by realization. This wasn't just a man in a wheelchair anymore. This was someone who carried weight, and he had returned with purpose. I request to speak under Section 47 of the Federal Oversight Clause, Raymond said, his voice as smooth as glass. As a federal investigator operating under the authority of the Department of Justice, I appear today not as a witness, but in official capacity. The judge hesitated. Mr. Ellis, she began carefully, her tone neutral, eyes scanning for stability. This is highly irregular. Raymond's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Irregular, he repeated calmly, is watching a man be dragged out of court for sitting where the law allows him. I will proceed. Before Whitaker could respond, another voice rose from the gallery. A woman stood. Third row. Hands trembling slightly, but her resolve stronger than her fear. In her hand she held a small tablet. I recorded what happened. Earlier, she said. If the court allows, I think people should see it. Valerie stepped forward, voice low, trying to regain control. Your Honor, this is out of protocol. That footage isn't verified. But Whitaker didn't stop the clerk. Maybe she saw the shift in the gallery. Maybe she felt it. Because the air had turned. The people had turned. And the court wasn't hers anymore. The clerk dimmed the lights. The screen lit up. The video was grainy, handheld, shaky, but what it captured was crystal clear. Valerie's voice, sharp, cold. "You don't belong here, old man. This isn't a soup kitchen." Then the shove. The screech of the wheelchair, Raymond lurching forward into the aisle. The camera panned. A child's voice broke through from the background. "Mom, why are they hurting him?" The courtroom sucked in a collective breath. Valerie's face drained of color. She looked at the screen like maybe, just maybe, if she stared hard enough she could erase it. Rewrite it. Silence it. But it was too late. The truth was already speaking. When the screen faded to black, the lights didn't return right away. The room sat in darkness a moment longer than necessary, long enough to let the weight settle, long enough for people to realize that this wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern. Raymond turned toward the gallery, then the bench, then back to the center of the room. He opened the folder. "This," he said, holding up a photograph, "is Malik Johnson." The image showed a 14-year-old boy. His skin was bruised along the jaw, one eye swollen shut. His lip was cracked, his eyes empty. The kind of emptiness that doesn't belong to childhood. In 2009, Raymond continued, he was arrested by Officer Valerie Grayson, tried in this very courtroom. Judge Whitaker presided, no cameras, no press, no one looking. He pulled out another page. "These are the medical records that were never submitted." Another. "This is the forensic request that was filed, but never processed." Another. "This," he said, holding up the final sheet, "is the original arrest report. What Officer Grayson later submitted was not this." Valerie stood. Her voice was fast, defensive. "I followed proper direction. I documented what I saw." Raymond turned to her, calm, deliberate. "And did you see a scared teenager as a threat? Did the directive tell you to deny him medical care for 12 hours? Did it instruct you to mark him aggressive when witnesses said otherwise?" She said nothing. Raymond turned back to the room. "Procedure is not an excuse for dehumanization," he said. "It never has been." From the back row, a voice cracked. A woman stood slowly, her hands clenched at her sides. "Malik was my son." The room turned. "He was a sweet boy," she whispered. "He loved to draw. He wanted to be a teacher. And we begged. We begged for someone to reopen the case." Tears rolled down her cheeks. But she didn't look broken. She looked tired. The kind of tired only a mother waiting 15 years for someone to finally speak can carry. Raymond placed the final file on the table and turned to the judge. "I met you once, Judge Whitaker," he said. 15 years ago. I was sent by the DOJ. We spoke for 10 minutes. You told me not to stir the waters." He exhaled. "I let it go. I told myself someone else would handle it. That justice, even delayed, would arrive." He looked around the room, let his eyes fall on the mother, then the child from earlier, then every face that had watched in silence. "Well, I haven't forgotten." He pulled out one last document. "I'm invoking the Civil Rights Emergency Review Clause. Effective immediately, this court is under federal scrutiny for the handling of the Malik Johnson case." A gasp. Valerie turned to the judge, eyes pleading for rescue, but Whitaker didn't speak. Her hands were clasped, her gaze fixed downward. Raymond's voice did not tremble. It did not gloat. "This is not about revenge. This is about responsibility." He stepped back, just enough for the silence to fill in behind him. For the child, who didn't grow up. For the mother who never stopped waiting. For the officers who served with honor and watched their work be tainted by others. And for the soul of this courtroom. No applause, no movement, only silence. And for the first time since he returned, the silence was no longer dismissive, it was listening. Justice didn't come like a hammer, it came like a mirror, and no one in that courtroom liked what they saw. The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. "This court is under federal scrutiny." A hush fell, not awkward, not uncertain. This was the hush of something final, the sound of a room realizing its own reflection. Judge Sylvia Whitaker didn't move. Her hands, still laced tightly together, began to tremble ever so slightly. Her eyes, fixed down on her notes, refused to lift. But it was no longer a matter of what she allowed. The reckoning had arrived, and it didn't need her permission. From the left of the courtroom, the side doors opened once more. This time not for Raymond, but for an agent from the Department of Justice. A woman in a black suit, no emotion on. Her face stepped forward and addressed the court in a calm, professional tone that cut through the stillness. In light of today's testimony and the re-examination of the 2009 Malik Johnson case, she began, Judge Sylvia Whitaker is hereby placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full federal investigation into allegations of judicial misconduct, racial bias, and obstruction of justice. You could feel the collective breath of the room halt mid-air. Whitaker's head snapped up. Her face wasn't angry. It was stunned. As if for the first time in 3 decades on the bench, she understood what accountability felt like. "You can't do this," she whispered, the words falling from her mouth like a prayer with no God listening. "I've served this court," the DOJ agent interrupted without cruelty but without hesitation. "You are not being dismissed. You are being held accountable." The judge sat back, her robe suddenly too heavy for her frame. Her hands began gathering papers she didn't know what to do with. She looked at no one. Not Raymond. Not Malik's mother. Not even herself. She didn't need to. The moment had already seen her. She rose from the bench slowly. No gavel, no closing statement. Just silence that clung to her as she stepped down, not as the authority in the room but as its subject. And then, without words, every pair of eyes shifted to Valerie Grayson. The woman who had commanded the room with sharp orders and unblinking, certainty now stood motionless, her back impossibly straight, her breathing shallow. The DOJ agent turned to her next. "Officer Grayson," the voice said firmly, "effective immediately, you are to remove your badge and service weapon." For a split second, it looked like Valerie might speak, might argue, might grab for the uniform she once wore like armor. But all she managed was a fractured sentence. I didn't know who he was." Raymond didn't move. He didn't need to. His voice filled the room like gravity. "That's the problem," he said. "You thought someone who looked like me could never be anyone." No one spoke. The words echoed not just in ears, but in memory. Valerie's hands shook as she unclipped her holster. Her badge clinked against the wood of the clerk's table. It was a quiet sound, but it hit the room like a falling verdict. Her eyes scanned the gallery, searching, pleading, for someone to speak on her behalf. A colleague, a supporter, a single friendly nod. There was none. Even those who might have once agreed with her posture now turned their gaze to the floor. Her certainty, once steel, had become her sentence. She stood frozen, alone in a sea of people who had finally decided to listen. A woman in the back row broke the silence, not with volume but with something deeper. "Now I believe. Silence is a sin. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rehearsed, but it spread." One by one, people began to rise. First, a postal worker in uniform. Then, an older woman with a cane. Then Marcus, the junior attorney who'd sat quietly throughout the morning, scribbling notes into a legal pad no one had asked for. He stood slowly, cleared his throat. His tie was frayed. His voice wasn't strong, but it was real. "I used to think staying quiet was wise," he said. "That if you waited long enough, the truth would reveal itself." He paused, looked directly at Raymond. "But it doesn't. People have to speak it. And silence is just cowardice in a clean suit." Raymond looked back at him. No smile, just a nod. The courtroom shifted. Energy changed. It wasn't defiance, it was release. People had been sitting with their own guilt, their own memories, their own complicity, and for the first time someone had given them permission to stand, and so they did. Raymond turned back to the center, his hands steady on the arms of his chair. "I didn't come here to ruin careers," he said. "I came to end silence." His voice didn't rise, he never shouted. But somehow it cut deeper than any accusation. It landed not on the ears but on the conscience. "This isn't about revenge," he continued. "This is about responsibility." He glanced at Malik's mother. Her face was tear-streaked, her posture proud. For the child who didn't get to grow up. For the mother who never stopped waiting. For every officer who watched good work be stained by silence. For every judge who thought protocol mattered more than people. He looked up, directly at the ceiling, at the same lights that had shone down on injustice for too long, and for the soul of this courtroom. There was no applause, no cheering. This wasn't a moment for celebration. It was colder than that. Quieter. More permanent. It was justice, not as thunder but as ice breaking after too many years of silence. The DOJ agent stepped back. Valerie was escorted out, the judge already gone, and Raymond, he did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. He had done what few ever dared. He had made a system see itself. He rolled back to the front row, not as a man seeking justice, but as the man who demanded it. He folded his hands gently and let the silence settle, not as a weapon, but as a verdict. Sometimes the loudest moment in history isn't a roar. It's a breath held in unity, a truth that finally refuses to be buried. The courthouse stood tall behind him, gray stone, unforgiving windows, a place built for power but rarely for mercy. Its steps stretched wide under the dying light of the day, shadows growing long like echoes of everything that had just unfolded inside. Raymond Ellis rolled forward slowly, not like a man leaving a battlefield, but like someone who had simply finished what needed to be done. No reporters chased him. No flashing lights, no soundbite media frenzy, just silence. The kind that carried weight. The kind that meant something had shifted. Maybe not everything, but enough. His navy blue DOJ suit caught the last rays of sunlight. But it was his face that held the story now. Calm. Lined. Eyes forward like he wasn't leaving anything behind, only making space for what had to come next. He reached the edge of the sidewalk, prepared to disappear the same way he arrived, quietly. But a voice, small, urgent, called out behind him. "Sir, wait." He turned. It was her. Lila, the little girl from the courtroom, the one who had asked the question no adult dared voice. The question that pierced the silence like a dagger. "Why? Are they hurting him, Mommy?" She ran up, breathless, her backpack bouncing behind her, name tag from a school field trip still pinned to her shirt. Her shoes were too big. Her voice was too soft. But her eyes, those eyes had already seen too much for someone her age. "I want to be like you," she said, looking up not with awe but with something gentler, a decision. A seed just planted. Raymond knelt down, slow from age and memory, letting the moment take its time. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her like she was holding a future even she didn't fully understand. Then he spoke, softly. "You don't need to be like me," he said. "You just need to hold on to what makes you kind. Hold it tight, even when the world tells you to let go." She looked confused for a second, not because she didn't understand, but because the world hadn't yet taught her how to forget. And maybe it never would. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, pulled out a small, worn badge, his first one. Not the DOJ shield he had just carried into battle, but something older. A simple city inspector emblem, scratched, dull, no, longer official. But heavy with memory, he pressed it into her small palm. "This isn't for power," he said. "It's to remind you. You don't need permission to do the right thing." She clutched it, like it was more than metal. Like it was a key. A few feet away, Clarence stood near the top of the courthouse steps. His uniform still neat, his posture still proud, but his eyes, those eyes said everything. He didn't speak, didn't wave. He just raised his hand slowly in a quiet salute. Not for the badge, Not for the title, for the man. Raymond returned the gesture with a small nod, enough to say what words couldn't. And still, the world outside the courtroom remained eerily normal. Cars passed. Pigeons fluttered across the sidewalk. A woman walked by with groceries. No one stopped him for a quote. No cameras followed. But inside those courthouse walls, something sacred had broken loose, and it would not be contained again. Later that evening, a clerk named Janine sat by her kitchen window writing in a leather-bound journal she hadn't opened in years. The light from the window was soft and orange, stretching across the wooden floor like memory itself. She wrote in slow, careful strokes. Today, justice didn't yell. It didn't throw fists or bark orders. But it made everyone in that courtroom hold their breath. It made us remember what it feels like to witness someone speak without raising their voice, and still be louder than everyone else in the room. She paused, stared out at the empty street, then added, "We always assumed justice came with noise. Today it came with silence. And we listened. For once, we truly listened." Back on the sidewalk, Raymond moved forward. Not like a man who had won, but like a man who had finished something long overdue. And yet, deep in the marrow of that evening's silence, you could feel it. This wasn't the end, because what he had started was only just beginning. A reckoning wasn't a moment. It was a motion, a momentum that moved through people, through systems, through generations. One child sees it, one man speaks, one room finally listens. The cycle breaks, not because everyone changed, but because someone did. Raymond didn't look back at the courthouse. He didn't need to. Some endings are quieter when you let them be. But just before he crossed the street, he paused, his hand instinctively brushing the inside of his coat, where Malik's photo still lived, close to his chest. He glanced upward, not in prayer, but in memory. Somewhere, Malik was watching. And this time, someone had stood up for him. This time, the silence didn't win. This isn't the end, because when one man dares to speak, others begin to listen. A courtroom changed. A city paused. A badge passed to a little girl who might one day wear it for all the right reasons. The story of Raymond Ellis isn't just about the system breaking. It's about the people brave enough to rebuild it. Stay tuned, because the next chapter of this reckoning is already moving in the shadows. And next time, when someone gets dragged across the room, they won't be alone. Not anymore.